A single block of stone, 40 feet long and weighing 300 tons, rests on a bed of wooden roller. Beneath a sky the color of old bone, 15,000 men strain against wet hemp ropes. Their feet, wrapped in straw, slide in the mud of the roadway. An overseer's voice is not a shout, but a chant, a rhythmic, guttural groan that rises from the collective effort. It is the year 1420, and this stone is not being moved to build a wall or a temple. It is being dragged, inch by agonizing inch, to become a threshold the common man will never cross, a threshold that will separate the mortal world from the seat of the Son of Heaven. We cannot hear the thoughts of the men who pull. We can only see the cords biting into their shoulders, the vapor of their breath in the cold air, and the sheer, terrifying weight of the ambition they are hauling forward. They are building not just a palace, but a universe in miniature, a city within a city, painted red like the sun and gilded like the emperor's mandate from heaven itself. They are building the forbidden city, and for the next 500 years, its vermilion walls will hold secrets that will birth empire, shatter dynasty, and define the very soul of a civilization. To understand the shadow they cast, we must first step into the light that forged them. The Hongwu Emperor, the man who had risen from a starving orphan to drive the Mongols from China and found the Ming Dynasty, lay dying. In the winter of 1398, the air in the palace of Nanjing was thick with incense and the quiet sobbing of concubine. But for one man hundreds of miles to the north in the frontier city of Beijing, the silence was deafening. Zhu Dai, the emperor's fourth son, listened to the wind scrape across his walls and waited. He was a soldier, not a scholar. His hands were made for a sword hilt, not a writing brush. He had the scars and the swagger of the steppe in his blood, a prince bred for war on the Mongol border. He had expected a summon. He had expected a role. He had expected, perhaps in his most secret heart, to be chosen. But the summons never came. When the news finally arrived, carried by a dust-caked rider whose horse collapsed in the compound, it was not a call to his father's bedside. It was a decree. The throne had passed not to a battle-hardened son, but to a boy of 16. The crown prince had died years before, and the old emperor, in a move that defied tradition and the instincts of his own blood, had named his grandson, Zhu Yunwen, as his heir. Zhu Dai read the edict in his great hall, the words swimming before him. His father was dead, and he, the prince who had bled for the dynasty, who had broken the Mongol Khans, was now expected to kneel before a child who saw him not as an uncle, but as a threat. Outside, the soldiers of his northern command stamped their feet against the cold, their breath plumbing in the fatting light. They watched their prince. They had fought for him, died for him. They knew his worth, and they saw the scroll tremble in his grip. In that tremor was not grief, but a cold, gathering storm. He was the fourth son, but he would not be forgotten. 3 years, the young Jianwen emperor ruled from the southern capital of Nanjing. He was a thoughtful boy, surrounded by Confucian scholars who whispered of the Han Dynasty, of ancient kings, and of the danger posed by powerful uncle. They called it Zhu Fan, reducing the feudal princes. One by one, the emperor's uncles were stripped of their titles, their armies, their freedom. Some were demoted to commoner, some were driven to suicide. The net tightened, province by province, moving inexorably north. In Beijing, Zhu Dai watched his brothers fall and felt the hemp ropes tightening around his own throat. He could submit, hand over his command, and walk into the captivity of his nephew's court, a prince without a princedom. Or he could do the unthinkable. The choice crystallized on a frozen morning in the summer of 1399. A spy from Nanjing, a eunuch who had served the old emperor, slipped through the gates of Beijing. He brought news that the imperial agents were already on the road. They carried an order for Zhu Dai's arrest. The boy emperor, fearful of his uncle's power, had finally decided to strike. In his private chambers, Zhu Dai stood before his armor. It was old, battered, scarred from 100 border skirmishes. He ran a finger over a deep gouge in the breastplate where a Mongol arrow had been turned aside. He was 40 years old, too old perhaps to begin a war, but too proud to end as a prisoner. He made his choice. That night, the prince who had defended the dynasty prepared to tear it apart. He summoned his closest generals, his adopted sons, and the spies and eunuchs who formed his shadow court. They met in a room lit by a single lantern. There was no grand map, no rousing speech. There was only the low murmur of conspiracy and the scratch of a knife on a wooden table, carving out the route south. Zhu Dai did not speak of a righteous cause. He did not claim his nephew a tyrant. He simply said, The emperor is young and surrounded by traitors. I am his uncle. It is my duty to remove them. It was a lie, and every man in the room knew it. But it was a noble lie, a lie wrapped in the silk of Confucian duty, and it would serve. The next morning, the drums of war beat from the walls of Beijing. The campaign to clear the troubles had begun. The fourth son was coming home. The war that followed was not a clean clash of armies, but a slow, grinding march of betrayal and blood. It lasted 3 years. Zhu Dai's forces were hardened northerner, veterans of the steppe, but the empire's loyalists held the center, the rice basket of the Yangtze, and the great walled cities of the south. The Jianwen emperor from his gilded cage in Nanjing sent army after army to crush his uncle, and army after army failed. Zhu Dai fought like a man who had nothing to lose, because he knew that if he lost, he would have nothing, not even his life. At the Battle of the Beigu River, his forces were pinned against the water, outnumbered and outflanked. For a moment, the rebellion teetered on the edge of annihilation. A strong wind rose, one of those sudden howling gales that sweep across the North China Plain. It ripped into the imperial ranks, tearing their banners, blinding their archers with dust, and whipping the river into a frenzy. Zhu Dai, seizing the moment like a gift from heaven, launched his personal cavalry, the chaos. He led the charge himself, his sword rising and falling, a prince drowning in the spray of blood. By nightfall, the river ran red and the road south lay open. But still Nanjing held. The walls of the capital were among the mightiest in the world, and within them the young emperor prayed for a miracle. He issued edicts, begged for loyalty, and starved. Inside the forbidden city, though it was not yet called that, the court began to fracture. Eunuchs who had been humiliated by the Confucian scholars saw their chance. They opened the gates. They sent word to Zhu Dai, "The city is yours. Come quickly." On the 13th of July, 1402, Zhu Dai rode through the gates of Nanjing. He did not enter as a triumphant liberator. He entered as a usurper, and the city knew it. The streets were empty. Shutters were closed. The only sound was the clatter of hooves on stone and the whisper of his own name spoken in. He made straight for the imperial palace, but when he arrived, he found only smoke. The palace was burning. The Jianwen emperor, his nephew, had set it ablaze and disappeared into the flame. They never found his body. They found a charred corpse, which they buried as an emperor, but no one truly believed it was him. The ghost of the boy king would haunt Zhu Dai for the rest of his life. That night, the fourth son walked through the smoldering ruins of his family's home. The throne room was still standing, but the dragon throne was empty, waiting. He approached it slowly, his boots crunching on shards of blackened tile. He did not sit, not yet. He stood before it, a man caked in the dust of a 3-year war, and he listened to the crackle of the dying embers. He had won. He was, by right of blood and steel, the emperor of all China. But the silence in that ruined hall was heavier than any crown. In the days that followed, the executions began. The scholars who had advised his nephew, the ones who had whispered of reducing the princes, were brought before him. He did not just kill them. He destroyed their families, their clans, their very name. One of them, a man named Fang Xiaoru, was ordered to draft the proclamation of Zhu Dai's ascension. He refused. He threw his brush to the ground and wept, shouting, "I would rather die. I will not draft a proclamation for a usurper." Zhu Dai's rage was absolute. He ordered Fang Xiaoru's mouth slit from ear to ear and then had him cut in half at the waist. 10 generations of his family, friends, students, distant cousins were hunted down and slaughtered. The number of dead, recorded in the official histories with cold precision, was 873. It was a message. The new emperor would be even if he could not be loved. The blood was washed from the stones of Nanjing. The charred palace was cleared, and Zhu Dai, the Prince of Yan, the fourth son, finally sat upon the dragon throne. He took a new name for his reign, Yongle, perpetual happiness. But as he sat there, looking out at the courtiers who bowed so low they could not see his face, he felt no happiness. He felt the cold eyes of history upon him. He felt the ghost of his nephew lurking in every shadow. And he knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones, that he could not rule from this city. This was his nephew's city. This was a place of ghosts and bad blood. He needed a new world. He needed a capital that was his alone. His gaze turned north, to the dusty, windswept city on the frontier where he had spent his youth. To Beijing, to home. The decision to move the capital was madness. For 1,000 years, the great dynasties had ruled from the fertile south or the central plain. The north was a barbarian frontier, a place of cold and hunger. too close to the Mongol hordes who still dreamed of revenge. Every scholar in his court, every minister who had survived the purge, counseled against it. But Yongle was not a man to be counseled. He was a man to be obeyed. He had a vision. He saw a city that would be the center of the universe, a physical manifestation of his divine right to rule. It would be a city built according to celestial order, a mirror of the heavens on earth. The emperor, the son of heaven, would sit at its heart, on a north-south axis aligned with the pole star, the unmoving center around which all else revolved. It would be a city of walls within walls, a labyrinth designed to humble the powerful and crush the rebellious. It would be a city forbidden to all but the chosen few. It would be, in his mind, his redemption. He summoned the greatest geomancers, the most skilled architects, the master craftsmen of the empire. He sent his agents across the land with a single command: bring everything. From the mountains of Sichuan, they dragged the giant Nanmu timber, each one a tree that had taken 1,000 years to grow. To move them, they had to wait for the rains to flood the logging trails, floating the massive logs down the rivers like the pillars of a drowned world. From the kilns of Suzhou, they demanded bricks. Not just any bricks, but golden bricks, dense, resonant bricks made from a special clay ground fine as flour, fired for months until they rang with a musical chime when struck. Millions of them. From the quarries of Fangshan near Beijing, they cut the great marble slabs in the dragonstone carving, hauling them across the frozen ground in winter, when they could create ice roads to slide the massive weights upon. They built a city not just with human hands, but with human lives. The official records, written by the men who survived, speak only of the grandeur. They describe the Hall of Supreme Harmony, its roof of yellow glazed tiles glittering like a golden mountain. They describe the Meridian Gate, its 5 towers rising like phoenixes about to take flight. They describe the moats, the gardens, the palaces within palaces. They do not describe the men who died to make it, but we can imagine them. We can imagine the stonemason from Hebei, crushed when a lifting rope snapped. We can imagine the carpenter from Jiangxi who fell from a scaffolding 100 feet high, his body landing silently in the mud. We can imagine the thousands of laborers, their names unremembered, who coughed their lungs out from the brick dust, who froze in the winter camps, who starved when the supply lines faltered. They were not building a palace. They were building a monument to one man's will, and they were the mortar in its walls. It took 14 years. 14 years of endless construction, of conscription, of death, and in 1420 it was done. The Forbidden City rose from the plain of Beijing, a vision of red and gold against the pale northern sky. It was, as Yongle had commanded, the largest palace complex the world had ever seen. It contained 980 buildings and over 9,000 rooms. It was a city that could hold 100,000 people. The emperor, his family, his court, his eunuchs, his servants, his soldiers, his concubine. It was a universe sealed behind vermilion walls. On a cold winter morning, Yongle led his court in a grand procession from the old Mongol city into his new capital. They crossed the bridges over the Golden Water River, passed through the Gate of Supreme Harmony, and entered the vast courtyard paved with white marble. The air was crisp. The sun, pale and weak, reflected off the golden tiles. The emperor walked alone, his yellow robes brushing the stone. Behind him, his generals, his ministers, his eunuchs, all of them bowed, their eyes fixed on the ground. None dared look up. As he ascended the steps to the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the very heart of his new world, Yongle paused. He turned and looked back. He saw the walls, the gates, the endless ranks of his prostrate subjects. He saw the city he had built from blood and stone. And for a moment, perhaps, he saw not his triumph, but his cage. He was the son of heaven, master of all he surveyed, but he was also its prisoner. The walls that kept the world out also kept him. The Forbidden City was his dream, his redemption, his masterpiece. It was also his tomb. The ceremonies ended. The courtiers retreated to their new quarter. The eunuchs began their endless, silent work. And the emperor sat alone on his throne, in the heart of his perfect city, listening to the wind whistle across 1,000 golden roofs. He had built a world that would outlast him, a world that would witness the grandeur and the decay of his dynasty for centuries to come. But on that first night, in the echoing silence of his new home, the only thing he could hear was the ghost of his nephew, laughing. The Forbidden City was not built. It was conjured. It rose from the flat, windswept plains north of the Mongol capital like a geomantic spell made flesh. a 1,000-acre mandala designed to harness the forces of the cosmos and channel them into the person of the emperor. To walk through its gates was to leave the mortal world behind. To stand before the throne was to stand before heaven itself, and to rule from within its walls was to exist in a state of perpetual, gilded isolation that would slowly drive the Ming emperors mad. But before it could become a prison, it had to become a home, and the home that Yongle demanded was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The planning alone took years. The emperor's geomancers, the feng shui masters who understood the flow of qi, or cosmic energy, surveyed the land with their compasses and their divining rods. They determined the exact north-south axis, the precise placement of every gate and hall, the alignment of the entire complex with the pole star, the celestial anchor around which the heavens turn. The emperor would sit at the southern end of this axis, facing south, his back protected by the northern hills, his gaze encompassing his realm. To his left in the east would be the sun and the masculine principle, yang, the halls where the emperor would conduct affairs of state. To his right in the west would be the moon and the feminine principle, yin, the quarters of the empress and the imperial consorts. The city within the city was a living diagram of the universe, a cosmic machine designed to ensure harmony between heaven and earth. But machines require fuel, and the fuel for Yongle's cosmic machine was human suffering. The labor force was assembled from every corner of the empire. The official histories speak of 1 million workers, 1 million souls, pulled from their farms, their families, their villages, and marched north to Beijing. They came as conscripts, as criminals sentenced to hard labor, as artisans promised glory they would never live to see. They came in chains and they came willingly, driven by the impossible weight of imperial decree. They were carpenters and masons, painters and sculptors, kiln workers and quarrymen. They were men, women, and children. They were the nameless, the forgotten, the foundation upon which the Forbidden City was built. The timber came first. In the deep forests of Sichuan, Yunnan, and Guizhou, the great Nanmu trees stood for centuries, their trunks rising 200 feet in the mist, their branches scraping the cloud. These were the pillars of the universe, the trees that would become the columns of the Hall of Supreme Harmony. The loggers who felled them worked in near darkness, the canopy above so thick that sunlight never touched the forest floor. They cut with axes and saws, their muscles screaming, their lungs filled with the damp, fungal air. When a tree finally fell, it came down with a groan that echoed through the mountains like the death cry of a god. Then the real work began. The trunks, stripped of their branches, weighed 20 tons or more. There were no roads. There were no wagons that could carry them. So the loggers waited. They waited for the monsoon rains, for the rivers to swell, for the mountain streams to become torrents. And then they rolled the great logs into the water, watching them crash and tumble down the rapid, praying they would not shatter on the rocks. Thousands of logs made the journey. Thousands were lost. The ones that survived traveled 1,000 miles, floating down the Yangtze, through the gorges, across the Great Lakes, and finally into the network of canals that fed Beijing. It took years. Some of the loggers who started the journey died before the timber ever reached the capital. Their sons took their place. Their sons' sons, perhaps, saw the pillars finally raised. The bricks were another kind of hell. In the kilns of Suzhou, 72 miles from the modern city of Shanghai, the craftsmen produced the golden bricks that would pave the floors of the palace. These were not ordinary bricks. The clay was specially selected, dug from deep pits, then dried in the sun, then soaked in water, then trodden by oxen until it reached the consistency of silk. It was then pressed into mold, air-dried for months, and finally fired in kilns fueled by pine wood. The firing lasted 130 days. The bricks emerged dense, smooth, and dark, with a metallic ring when struck. A single brick could cost as much as a peasant farmer's annual income. The palace required millions of. The kilns burned day and night, the smoke blackening the sky, the heat warping the faces of the men who fed the flame. They worked until they collapsed, until their skin cracked and their eyes went blind. And when they died, there were always more to take their place. The stone came from the quarries of Fangshan, 30 miles southwest of Beijing. It was here that the greatest challenge of all awaited. Yongle, in his obsession with cosmic perfection, demanded a monumental carving for the staircase of the Hall of Supreme Harmony. It would be a single slab of marble, nearly 60 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 3 feet thick. It would weigh, by modern estimates, over 300 tons. It would be carved with 9 dragons, writhing in clouds, symbols of the emperor's power, and it had to be moved from the quarry to the palace. The problem was simple. No wheeled vehicle could carry such a weight. The wheels would sink into the earth, the axles would shatter, the oxen would be crushed. The solution was ancient, brutal, and effective. They waited for winter. They waited for the ground to freeze, for the dirt roads to become rivers of ice. Then they flooded the path. They built a road of ice, a slick, treacherous highway stretching 30 miles across the frozen plain. Onto this road they dragged the great stone. It rested on a wooden sledge, and beneath the sledge they placed rollers. But the rollers were not enough. They needed pullers. They assembled 15,000 men. 15,000 conscripts, soldiers, and prisoners, their hands wrapped in rags, their feet bound in straw for traction. They attached ropes to the sledge, hemp ropes as thick as a man's arm, and they began to pull. For 28 days they pulled. They pulled from dawn until dusk, their bodies leaning forward, their feet slipping on the ice, their breath freezing in the air. They pulled through snowstorms and biting wind. They pulled past the bodies of those who fell and were trampled, their corpses left frozen by the roadside. They pulled to the rhythm of the overseer's chants, a mournful, rhythmic groan that rose from the collective effort. Heave, ho, heave, ho. And slowly, inch by agonizing inch, the great dragon stone moved toward the city. When it finally arrived, when it was lifted into place at the foot of the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the emperor did not come to see it. He did not thank the men who had dragged it. He did not acknowledge their suffering. He simply noted in the imperial records that the stone had been delivered according to plan. The men who pulled it were dismissed, sent back to their villages, or assigned to the next task. Their names were never recorded. Their stories were never told. They vanished into the earth they had helped to pave. While the laborers toiled, the architects drew. The city took shape on paper before it took shape in stone. The layout was a series of concentric squares, each one a wall within a wall, a gate within a gate. The outer wall, 25 feet high and 30 feet thick, enclosed the entire complex. Within that, a second wall enclosed the imperial city, the administrative heart of the empire. Within that, a third wall enclosed the palace itself. And at the very center, behind yet another wall, lay the inner court, the private quarters of the emperor and his family. Each wall was a threshold, a barrier, a reminder that access to the emperor was not a right but a privilege, granted only to the few and revoked at the slightest whisper of disloyalty. The gates were fortresses in themselves. The Meridian Gate, the main southern entrance, was a massive structure of towers and watchtowers, its 5 gateways reserved for different purposes. The central arch, the largest, was for the emperor alone. No one else could pass through it. Not his generals, not his ministers, not even his son. To the east, a smaller arch was for civil officials. To the west, another for military officers. And the 2 smallest, farthest from the center, were for everyone else, for the eunuchs, the servants, the messengers who kept the empire running. Every person who entered the Forbidden City was assigned their place in this hierarchy, their position relative to the center. The city was not just a palace. It was a map of power, written in stone. And then there was the color, vermilion, the red of the sun, of life, of good fortune. The walls, the columns, the window frames, everything was painted in this deep, luminous red made from powdered cinnabar mixed with tung oil. It was a color that seemed to glow, even in shadow, a constant reminder of the emperor's fiery presence. The roofs were covered in yellow glazed tiles, the color of the earth, of the center, of the emperor himself. Only the emperor could use yellow. Anyone else who dared to wear it, to fly it, to paint it, would be executed. The city was a symphony of color, each shade a code, each tile a declaration of absolute power. In 1420, the Forbidden City was complete. Yongle, now in the 18th year of his reign, prepared to move his court from Nanjing. It was not a simple journey. It was a migration. The entire apparatus of the Ming government, the ministries, the bureaus, the archives, the treasury, had to be transported north. Tens of thousands of officials, soldiers, servants, and family members packed their belongings and began the long trek. They traveled by road, by canal, by river, a great river of humanity flowing toward the new capital. And when they arrived, they found a city waiting for them, a city that had cost 1 million lives to build, a city that would now become their world. The first court sessions in the new palace were formal, ritualized affairs. The officials, dressed in their silk robes of rank, blue for the lowest, red for the middle, purple for the highest, assembled in the vast courtyard before dawn. They stood in ranks arranged by seniority, their faces turned toward the Hall of Supreme Harmony. They stood in silence, their breath misting in the cold, waiting for the emperor to appear. And when he did, when the doors of the hall opened and the Son of Heaven emerged in his dragon robes, they prostrated themselves, pressing their foreheads to the cold marble. They did not look up. They did not speak. They did not exist. They were simply subjects, grains of sand on the shore of the imperial present. Yongle looked out at this sea of bowed backs and felt, perhaps for the first time, the true weight of what he had built. He was no longer a usurper, no longer a prince who had clawed his way to power. He was the center of the universe, the pivot on which heaven and earth turn. The city was his mirror, reflecting his power back at him from every golden tile, every vermilion wall. But mirrors, as he would learn, do not show the soul. They show only what is placed before them. Within the walls, life was not as serene as the rituals suggested. The city was a living organism, teeming with activity. In the eastern quarters, the eunuchs managed the palace's vast bureaucracy, keeping the accounts, maintaining the stores, organizing the endless ceremony. In the western quarters, the consorts lived in gilded seclusion, their lives governed by a rigid hierarchy of rank and favor. The empress, the primary wife, ruled over this inner realm, but her rule was always contested, always fragile. A new concubine, younger and more beautiful, could steal the emperor's favor and upset the balance of years. Jealousy festered behind painted screens. Whispers echoed through the covered walkway. Poison, both literal and metaphorical, was a constant threat. And then there were the children. The emperor's sons, the princes of the blood, were raised in their own quarters, educated by the finest scholars, trained in the arts of war and governance. But they were also prisoners, watched by eunuchs, spied upon by their own servants. They could not leave the city without permission. They could not form alliances without suspicion. They could not even visit their mothers without a formal request. They were being groomed for power, but they were also being prepared for the knife. For every prince who ascended the throne, a dozen others lived in fear of being accused of treason, of being purged to secure the succession. Yongle himself, for all his power, was not immune to the city's isolating effects. He had built the Forbidden City to be his fortress, but it was also his cage. The walls that kept his enemies out also kept the world at a distance. He no longer rode among his soldiers. He no longer walked the streets of his capital. He was carried in a sedan chair from hall to hall, from ceremony to ceremony, a living god who never touched the earth. The people of Beijing saw his processions, the banners and the music, the ranks of guards in gleaming armor, but they never saw him. He was a rumor, a legend, a face on a coin. In the evenings, when the ceremonies were done and the court had retired, Yongle would sometimes climb to the top of the Prospect Hill, the artificial mountain built just north of the palace to block evil spirits from the north. From there, he could look down upon his creation, the sea of golden roofs, the geometric precision of the courtyards, the winding canals. He could see the lights flickering in the thousands of rooms, the shadows moving behind paper screens. He could hear, if he listened carefully, the distant murmur of 1,000,000 lives contained within his walls. And he would wonder, perhaps, if he had built a monument to his greatness or a tomb for his soul. The Forbidden City was complete. The emperor was home, and the dynasty, for good or ill, was now sealed within its walls, destined to live and die in the shadow of its own perfection. But beyond those walls, beyond the gates and the moats and the endless ranks of soldiers, a world was waiting. A world of oceans and elephants, of strange gods and stranger men. A world that would soon come knocking, carried on the decks of the largest ships the world had ever seen. While the Forbidden City rose from the plains of Beijing, sealing the emperor in his gilded cage, another world was opening just beyond the horizon. It was a world of turquoise water and spice-scented winds, of ivory and incense, of kings who wore peacock feathers and worshipped strange gods. It was a world that the Ming emperors had forgotten, a world their fathers had abandoned when they drove out the Mongol. But Yongle, the usurper who needed to prove his legitimacy to every corner of the earth, remembered, and he had the perfect man to find it. His name was Mahi, but the world would come to know him as Zheng He. He was born in 1371 in the mountainous province of Yunnan, on the southwestern frontier of the Chinese Empire. His father was a Haji, a Muslim who had made the pilgrimage to Mecca, and his family claimed descent from an early Persian governor of the region. But when Mahi was 10 years old, the armies of the Ming Dynasty swept into Yunnan, crushing the last resistance to the new order. The boy was captured, castrated according to the brutal custom for prisoners of war, and sent north to serve in the household of the Prince of Yan. That prince was Zhu Dai. The boy who would become a eunuch slave would become the admiral of the world's greatest fleet. In the household of the prince, he grew. He learned the arts of war and navigation, the intricacies of court politics, the languages of the steppe and the desert. He stood over 6 feet tall, a giant in an age of smaller men, with a voice that carried across a battlefield and a mind that could calculate the stars. He fought beside his master in the Civil War, earning his trust and his respect. And when Zhu Dai became the Yongle emperor, he rewarded his loyal eunuch with a new name, Zheng He. It was a name of honor, a name that would one day be spoken from the coasts of Africa to the islands of Indonesia. The emperor's vision was vast. He wanted the world to know that a new son of heaven sat on the dragon throne. He wanted tribute, not just from the neighboring kingdoms, but from the far corners of the earth. He wanted spices and gems, exotic animals and strange medicines. But more than that, he wanted recognition. He wanted the kings of the world to bow, to send their envoys to his new capital, to acknowledge his mandate. And so he ordered the construction of a fleet, unlike any the world had ever seen. The shipyards of Nanjing on the banks of the Yangtze River became a city of their own. Tens of thousands of carpenters, sailmakers, rope makers, and caulkers worked day and night. They built ships in dry docks, sliding them into the river on greased ramps when they were complete. They built standard ships, supply ships, warships, and horse transport. And they built the treasure ships, the flagships of the fleet, the largest wooden vessels in human history. The Chinese records speak of ships 9-masted, 400 feet long and 160 feet wide. They were longer than a football field, wider than any wooden ship would ever be again. They had 9 staggered masts, 12 watertight compartments, and decks large enough to carry 500 men. They were floating cities, self-contained worlds designed to traverse the oceans and awe the barbarian. The technology that built them was centuries ahead of the West. The Chinese had mastered the magnetic compass, the central rudder, and the watertight bulkhead. Their sails were made of silk and bamboo, stiffened with batten so they could be trimmed like a Venetian blind. Their anchors were of ironwood, carved from single trees weighing tons. And their navigation, a combination of compass reading, celestial observations, and the careful recording of landmarks, was an art form passed down through generations. When the treasure ships finally set sail, they carried not just sailors, but soldiers, doctors, scribes, interpreters, astrologers, and diplomats. They carried gifts for foreign kings, silk and porcelain, gold and silver, lacquerware and bronze mirror. And they carried a message. The emperor of the great Ming Dynasty extends his hand in friendship. Take it and prosper. Refuse and face the consequences. In the autumn of 1405, the fleet departed. From the decks of his flagship, the largest of them all, Zheng He watched the coast of China disappear below the horizon. He was a man without a country, a eunuch who could never have a family, a Muslim serving a Buddhist emperor. But on the deck of that ship, surrounded by the greatest fleet the world had ever seen, he was the master of all he surveyed. The wind filled the silk sail, the compass needle pointed south, and the great adventure began. The first voyage took them to the spice islands of Java and Sumatra, to the pirate-infested straits of Malacca, to the great trading port of Calicut on the coast of India. At every stop, Zheng He performed the same ritual. He anchored his fleet in the harbor, the enormous ships dwarfing the local vessels. He sent messengers ashore with gifts and invitation, and when the local king or chieftain came aboard, he showed them the power of the Ming. He showed them the soldiers in their gleaming armor, the astronomers with their bronze instrument, the scribes with their endless scroll. He showed them the porcelain so fine you could see through it, the silk so light it seemed to float. And then he presented the emperor's gifts, and he waited. Some came willingly. The king of Calicut, a thriving Hindu kingdom on the Malabar coast, welcomed the Chinese with open arms. His port was a crossroads of the Indian Ocean trade, where Arabs brought horses from Persia, Africans brought ivory and gold, and Chinese brought silk and porcelain. He saw in Zheng He an opportunity, a chance to increase his own power and prestige. He sent envoys back to China, bearing gifts of pepper and ginger, pearls and ruby. He bowed to the emperor, at least in name, and the emperor was pleased. Others were less cooperative. In the Straits of Malacca, the narrow waterway between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, the fleet encountered a pirate king named Chen Zui. He was a Chinese renegade, a warlord who had fled the Ming conquest decades before and established his own kingdom of crime. He controlled the straits, preying on merchant ships, amassing a fortune in plunder. He saw Zheng He's fleet not as a threat, but as an opportunity. The treasure ships, he imagined, would be the greatest prize of his career. He planned a sneak attack, a sudden strike under cover of darkness that would catch the Chinese off guard and deliver their treasure into his hand. But Zheng He was not a man to be caught off guard. His spies, his eunuch network that stretched across the seas, brought him word of the plot. He prepared his own ambush, hiding his warships behind islands, positioning his archers in the rigging. When the pirates attacked, they sailed straight into a killing zone. The Chinese warships emerged from hiding, surrounding the pirate fleet. Arrows rained down from the mast. Fire bombs, primitive grenades of gunpowder and ceramic, shattered on pirate decks. The battle was brief, brutal, and utterly one-sided. Chen Zuyi was captured, chained, and brought aboard the flagship. He knelt before Zheng He, his dreams of empire reduced to ashes. Zheng He looked down at him, this fellow Chinese who had chosen piracy over loyalty, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The pirate king was taken back to Nanjing, paraded through the streets in a cage, and beheaded before the assembled court. It was a message to the world. The long arm of the Ming Dynasty could reach anywhere. There was no place to hide. The voyages continued, 7 in total over the course of 28 years. They sailed to Hormuz, the great Persian port at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, where they traded silk for pearls and horses. They sailed to Aden on the coast of Yemen, where they presented gifts to the Sultan and received in return a giraffe, a creature the Chinese courtiers mistook for the mythical Qilin, a beast of such good omen that the emperor himself came out to greet it. They sailed to Mogadishu on the African coast, where they traded porcelain for ivory and rhinoceros horn. They sailed to the very edge of the known world, mapping the coastline, recording the customs, collecting the treasures of 100 kingdoms. On board the ships, life was a floating microcosm of the empire. The sailors slept in hammocks, ate their meals in shifts, and worked the ropes and sails with the rhythm of generation. The soldiers drilled on the decks, their swords and spears flashing in the tropical sun. The doctors treated fevers and wounds with herbal medicine, acupuncture, and the careful observation of symptoms. The scribes recorded everything: the winds and currents, the appearance of strange fish, the customs of foreign people. And Zheng He, the eunuch admiral, moved among them all, a calm and commanding presence. He prayed to Allah in his private cabin, 5 times a day, facing west toward Mecca. He consulted with Buddhist monks and Hindu priests, respecting the gods of every land he visited. He was a man of many worlds, and he belonged to none of them. But while Zheng He sailed the oceans, bringing the world to the feet of the emperor, a different kind of battle was raging within the Forbidden City. It was a battle of ideas, a battle for the soul of the dynasty. On one side stood the eunuchs, the men without families, without futures, without loyalty to anyone but the emperor himself. They had accompanied Zheng He on his voyages, managed the vast warehouses where the treasures were stored, controlled the flow of information into and out of the palace. They had grown rich, powerful, indispensable. On the other side stood the scholar officials, the Confucian bureaucrats who had run the empire for 1,000 years. They came from noble families, passed rigorous examinations, and believed that the empire should be ruled by virtue, not by force. They saw the eunuchs as parasites, as threats to the moral order, as a cancer within the body politic. The conflict came to a head over a simple question: should the voyages continue? The scholars argued the voyages were expensive, they said. They drained the treasury, distracted the court from its true duties, and brought back nothing but useless trinkets and exotic animals. The true treasures of the empire were grain and taxes, peace and order. The barbarians beyond the seas were of no concern. Let them stew in their ignorance. China was the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom. It needed nothing from outside. The eunuchs argued yes. The voyages brought tribute, they said. They brought prestige, they brought knowledge, they brought the recognition of foreign kings. They demonstrated the power of the Ming to the farthest corners of the earth. To stop them now would be an admission of weakness, a retreat into isolation. The emperor's mandate was universal. How could it be universal if half the world had never heard of it? For a time, Yongle listened to the eunuchs. He loved the treasure ships, the exotic gifts, the endless stream of foreign envoys bowing before his throne. But in 1424, after 22 years on the dragon throne, The emperor who had built the Forbidden City and launched the greatest fleet in history died. He died on a campaign against the Mongol, still fighting the wars of his youth, still trying to prove himself. His body was returned to Beijing in secret, wrapped in silk, hidden in a wagon. The court announced that he had died of illness, that his passing was peaceful, that the dynasty would continue. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. The old usurper had finally been usurped, not by a rival, but by time itself. His successor, the Hongxi emperor, was a scholar at heart. He hated the voyages, hated the eunuchs, hated the endless expense. One of his first acts was to halt the treasure fleets. The great ships were left to rot in their docks, their masts slowly decaying, their hulls filling with water. The sailors were dismissed, the interpreters sent home, the maps filed away in dusty archives. Zheng He, now an old man, watched his life's work dissolve. He made one final voyage in 1431 under a later emperor who briefly revived the dream. He sailed as far as Mecca, fulfilling the dream of his father, the Haji who had died when he was a boy. But when he returned, the winds of the court had shifted again. The scholars had won. The voyages would never resume. Zheng He died in 1433, probably at sea on the journey home. They buried him in Nanjing, in a tomb shaped like a ship's rudder, overlooking the Yangtze River. His fleet was scattered, his records destroyed or hidden, his achievements erased from the official history. For centuries, he was forgotten, a footnote in the story of a dynasty that had turned its back on the world. But the world did not forget. In the ports of Calicut and Hormuz, in the markets of Malacca and Aden, the memory of the great Chinese ships lingered. The old men told their grandchildren of the floating cities that had appeared from nowhere, the silk sails that had blotted out the sun, the admiral who had come in peace and left in glory. And somewhere in the secret archives of the Forbidden City, the maps remain. Maps that showed the coast of Africa, the islands of the Indian Ocean, the winds and currents of a world that China had once ruled and then abandoned. The ships rotted, the sailors died, the knowledge faded, and the dynasty, having reached out and touched the world, chose to pull its hand back. The walls of the Forbidden City grew higher, thicker, more absolute. The emperor sat at the center of the universe, and the universe shrank to fit the space between the vermilion walls. But outside, beyond the gates, beyond the empire, the oceans waited. And the question, unspoken but ever present, hung in the air. What if they had kept sailing? What if they had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, crossed the Atlantic, reached the shores of a continent they did not know existed? What would the world have become? The ships rotted. The question remained unanswered. And the dynasty, sealed in its splendid isolation, began its long, slow decline into paranoia and decay. The walls of the Forbidden City were never meant to keep the world out. They were meant to keep the emperor in. And once the voyages ceased, once the last treasure ship rotted in its dock and the maps of distant shores were consigned to the archives, the weight of those walls began to press inward. The emperors who followed Yongle were not warrior. They were not builders or explorer. They were prisoner, raised in the gilded isolation of the palace, surrounded by eunuchs and concubines, taught to see enemies in every shadow. And the shadows in the Forbidden City were very deep. The Chongzhen emperor, Yongle's grandson, was the last of the early Ming rulers to lead troops in person. He was a competent man, a painter of some skill, a patron of the arts. But even he could feel the walls closing in. He trusted his eunuchs more than his generals, his servants more than his scholar. And it was under his reign that the machinery of surveillance began to tighten. The eunuchs, denied the glory of the treasure fleets, sought power in another realm, the realm of secret. The instrument of their power was the Eastern Depot. It began as a simple intelligence office, a place where eunuchs could gather information from the empire and report directly to the emperor. But it quickly became something darker. The depot had its own prisons, its own courts, its own executioner. It answered to no one but the emperor himself. And the emperor, isolated behind his walls, dependent on his eunuchs for news of the outside world, became a prisoner of their information. They told him what they wanted him to hear. They showed him enemies they had created. They fed his paranoia until it consumed him. But the Eastern Depot was not alone. It had a partner, a shadow brother, older and more terrifying, the Brocade Guard. The guard had been founded by the Hongwu Emperor Yongle's father as his personal bodyguard and secret police. They wore distinctive uniforms of embroidered silk, the brocade that gave them their name, but their work was anything but beautiful. They were the emperor's eyes and his sword in the dark. They could arrest anyone anywhere without warning or warrant. They could torture confessions from the innocent, fabricate evidence against the loyal, and execute the condemned in secret, their bodies dumped in unmarked graves. The people of Beijing spoke of them in whisper, if they spoke of them at all. To attract the attention of the Brocade Guard was to disappear from the world. Together, the Eastern Depot and the Brocade Guard formed a parallel government, a shadow state within the state. They spied on the officials, the generals, the merchants, the common people. They spied on each other. They reported to the emperor, but they also reported to the chief eunuch, the head of the palace staff, a man who had risen from poverty and castration to become one of the most powerful figures in the empire. And the chief eunuch, in turn, answered only to the emperor. It was a closed loop of power, a circuit of paranoia that fed on itself. For the scholar officials, the Confucian bureaucrats who had run the empire for centuries, this was a nightmare. They believed in law, in precedent, in the moral example of the ancients. They believed that the emperor should rule through them, that they were the guardians of tradition, the keepers of the Confucian way. But the eunuchs had no respect for tradition. They had no families, no lineages, no ancestors to honor. They had only the emperor's favor, and they would do anything to. They saw the scholars as rivals, as threats, as men who believed themselves superior to the servants who fed them and clothed them and wiped their mouths at dinner. The conflict was inevitable, and in the Forbidden City, conflicts did not end in compromise. They ended in blood. The first great purge came in 1449, under the reign of the Zhengtong emperor, a boy of 7 when he ascended the throne. The real power lay with the eunuchs, especially with a man named Wang Zhen. He was arrogant, ambitious, and utterly convinced of his own genius. He convinced the young emperor to lead a campaign against the Mongols, despite the warnings of every experienced general in the empire. The campaign was a disaster. The army was surrounded, the emperor captured, Wang Zhen killed by his own officers in a moment of desperate rage. It was the first time in Ming history that an emperor had fallen into enemy hands. The dynasty teetered on the edge of collapse. But the Forbidden City adapted. The emperor's brother was placed on the throne. The captured emperor was declared retired, a ghost ruler in a Mongol tent, and the machinery of surveillance ground on, indifferent to the chaos outside the walls. The Brocade Guard arrested anyone who whispered of defeat. The Eastern Depot tortured anyone who questioned the new emperor's legitimacy. The scholars who had warned against the campaign were silenced or killed. And when the former emperor was finally released after years of captivity, he returned to find his throne occupied, his friends dead, his world transformed. He was placed under house arrest in the southern section of the Forbidden City, a prisoner in the palace he had once ruled. The gates were locked, the guards were chained, and the walls, which had always protected the emperor, now protected the empire from him. For 7 years he waited, 7 years in a gilded cage, watching the seasons change through a paper window, listening to the whispers of eunuchs who might be spies or might be savior. And then, in 1457, the whispers became a conspiracy. On a dark winter night, a group of eunuchs loyal to the old emperor smuggled him out of his prison and into the main halls of the palace. They seized the throne, arrested the reigning emperor, and restored the captive to power. It was a coup within the walls, a palace revolution that changed nothing and everything. The emperor was back. But the paranoia, the suspicion, the endless surveillance, that remained. It had become the air the Forbidden City breathed. The restored emperor, now calling himself the Tianqian emperor, had learned a bitter lesson: trust no one. He had spent 7 years as a prisoner because his own brother had seized his throne. He had been rescued by eunuchs, but he knew that eunuchs could betray as easily as they could save. His paranoia was a living thing, a serpent coiled in his gut, and it drove him to acts of terrible cruelty. One of his first targets was a man named Yu Kaiyan, the minister of war who had organized the defense of Beijing during the emperor's captivity. Yu Kaiyan was a hero. He had saved the capital, preserved the dynasty, and done everything in his power to secure the emperor's release. But he had also supported the new emperor, the brother who had taken the throne. In the twisted logic of the restored ruler, that made him a traitor. Yu Kaiyan was arrested by the Brocade Guard, tortured in the dungeons of the Eastern Depot, and executed in the marketplace of Beijing. His property was confiscated, his family exiled, his name erased from the official records. The people who watched him die wept, for they knew he was innocent. But they wept in silence, for they also knew that the brocade guard was watching. The execution of Yu Qian sent a message to every official in the empire. Loyalty was no protection. Virtue was no shield. The only safety lay in silence, in invisibility, in never attracting the attention of the shadow men in their embroidered uniform. The scholars retreated into their studies, burying themselves in ancient texts, writing poetry that no one would read, dreaming of a golden age that had never existed. The eunuchs grew bolder, more powerful, more corrupt. They sold offices, took bribes, built themselves palaces within the palace. They controlled access to the emperor, and access was everything. A word from a eunuch could make a man's fortune. A whisper could end his life. The Forbidden City became a labyrinth of whisper. In the eastern quarters, where the eunuchs had their offices, the corridors echoed with the rustle of silk and the murmur of conspiracy. In the western quarters, where the consorts lived, the air was thick with jealousy and intrigue. A concubine who fell from favor might find herself poisoned, or strangled, or simply forgotten, left to wither in a locked room until she died. A eunuch who displeased his master might be beaten or banished or sent to the kitchens to spend the rest of his life scrubbing pots. And everywhere there were spies. The servants spied on the concubines spied on each other. The eunuchs spied on the officials spied on the eunuchs, and the brocade guard spied on everyone. The emperors themselves were not immune. They grew up in this atmosphere, nursed on suspicion, weaned on fear. They learned from childhood that smiles could hide daggers, that kindness was a trap, that the only person they could trust was themselves. Some of them retreated into debauchery, spending their days and nights in the company of concubines, seeking oblivion in wine and sex. Some retreated into religion, building temples within the palace, consulting monks and astrologers, searching for meaning in the stars. Some retreated into madness, seeing enemies in every shadow, ordering executions on a whim, descending into a paranoia so profound that they could no longer function. The Zheng emperor, who reigned in the early 1500s, was one of the mad ones. He refused to live in the Forbidden City, preferring a complex of pleasure palaces outside the walls. He dressed as a commoner, wandered the streets of Beijing, and delighted in shocking his courtier. He promoted his favorites, eunuchs and soldiers and actors, to the highest position, ignoring the scholars who had spent their lives preparing to serve. He led military campaigns not out of duty but out of a thirst for adventure. He died at 30, probably from drowning after a boating accident, though some whispered that he had been murdered. By the time of his death, the machinery of surveillance had grown so powerful that no one could be sure of anything. The truth, like everything else in the Forbidden City, had become a secret. The Jiajing emperor who followed was a different kind of mad. He was obsessed with Taoism, with alchemy, with the search for immortality. He withdrew from the court, refusing to see his ministers for decades, conducting affairs of state through written messages passed under his door. He spent his days in a haze of incense and elixirs, many of them containing mercury and arsenic, slowly poisoning himself in the pursuit of eternal life. And in his isolation, he allowed the eunuchs and the secret police to run wild. In 1542, a group of concubines tried to kill him. They crept into his chamber while he slept and tried to strangle him with a cord, but they botched the knot. He woke, screamed, and the guards came running. The concubines were arrested, tortured, and executed in the most gruesome manner imaginable. The empress, who may have been involved, was burned alive. The emperor, shaken but alive, became more paranoid than ever. He moved his sleeping quarters constantly, never staying in the same room 2 nights in a row. He trusted no one, not even his own shadow. And the Forbidden City, already a place of whispers, became a place of silence. No one spoke unless spoken to. No one moved unless ordered. The courtiers walked on tiptoe, their eyes fixed on the ground, afraid that a glance, a gesture, a breath might be misinterpreted as treason. It was in this atmosphere that the eunuchs reached the peak of their power. Men like Liu Jin, under the Zheng emperor, had amassed fortunes that rivaled the imperial treasury. They built themselves mansions, collected art, and lived like kings. They controlled the appointment of officials, the collection of taxes, the distribution of justice. They were, for all practical purposes, the rulers of China. And when they fell hard. Liu Jin was finally arrested, tried, and executed by slow slicing, a punishment that took 3 days to complete. The crowd that gathered to watch his death cheered, for they hated him with a passion born of years of oppression. But even as they cheered, they knew that another eunuch would rise to take his place. The system was too entrenched, too powerful, too necessary to the functioning of the palace. The eunuchs were the glue that held the forbidden city together. Without them, the whole edifice would collapse. So the dance continued. The scholars and the eunuchs locked in their endless struggle for the emperor's ear. The secret police watching everything, reporting nothing. The emperors, isolated and paranoid, slowly losing their grip on reality. And the people, the millions of peasants and farmers and merchants who lived outside the walls, they paid the price. Taxes rose to support the palace's endless appetite. Corruption drained the treasury. Natural disasters went unrelieved. Bandits roamed the countryside. And on the northern frontier, beyond the Great Wall, a new threat was gathering. The Mongols had been replaced by a different people, a people from the forests of Manchuria, a people who watched the decay of the Ming with hungry eyes. Inside the Forbidden City, life continued as it always had. The rituals were performed, the ceremonies were observed, the eunuchs whispered, the concubines schemed, the emperor sat alone on his dragon throne, a prisoner in his own home. But outside, beyond the vermilion walls, the world was changing. The dynasty was running out of time. And soon, very soon, the walls would no longer be enough to hold back the tide. The signs were there for anyone who cared to see. In the provinces, famine drove peasants to eat tree bark and clay. In the cities, riots broke out over taxes and corruption. In the army, soldiers went unpaid, their loyalty purchased by anyone with coin. And in the Forbidden City, the last emperors of the Ming played their games of power and paranoia, oblivious to the storm that was about to break over their heads. The storm had a name. His name was Li Zicheng, and he was coming. The Jiajing emperor died in 1567, poisoned by his own elixirs, his body finally succumbing to the mercury and arsenic he had consumed in his quest for immortality. The Longqing emperor who followed lasted only 6 years, a brief interlude of competent rule that gave the dynasty a momentary respite. And then, in 1572, a boy of 9 ascended the dragon throne. His reign name was Wanli, and he would rule for 48 years, longer than any emperor in Ming history. He would also, in his own way, deliver the final blow to the dynasty his ancestors had built. For the first decade of his reign, Wanli was guided by a brilliant chief tutor named Zhang Zhezhang, a man of iron will and reformist vision. Zhang slashed government spending, reorganized the tax system, and restored discipline to the army. He was, in many ways, the last great statesman of the Ming, but he was also arrogant, ruthless, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. He made enemies among the eunuchs, among the scholars, among everyone who benefited from the old system of corruption. And when he died, in 1582, those enemies emerged from the shadows to destroy his memory and his family. Wanli, now a young man of 19, had loved Zhang like a father, but the young emperor was weak, easily swayed by the whispers of his eunuchs and the tears of his concubine. He allowed Zhang's enemies to conduct a posthumous investigation, to fabricate charges of corruption, and Zhang's property was confiscated. His sons were exiled. His oldest son was tortured until he committed suicide. The reforms were rolled back. The corruption returned. And Wanli, traumatized by the destruction of the man he had trusted most, began his long retreat from the world. He stopped attending court sessions. He stopped meeting with his minister. He stopped reading memorials, the official reports from the provinces that were the lifeblood of imperial governance. He withdrew into the inner court, into the company of his eunuchs and his favorite concubine, a woman named Lady Zhang. For 25 years, he refused to perform even the most basic duties of an emperor. The bureaucracy ground to a halt. Vacancies went unfilled. Justice went undelivered. And the empire, left to drift, began to come apart. The reasons for Wanli's withdrawal were complex. Partly it was grief, partly it was laziness, partly it was a profound disillusionment with the Confucian scholars who had destroyed his mentor. But mostly, it was a dispute over the succession. He wanted to make Lady Zheng's son his heir, bypassing the eldest son, who had been born to a concubine he did not love. The scholars, bound by centuries of tradition, refused. They bombarded him with memorials, lectured him on duty, shamed him in public. And Wanli, instead of fighting, simply gave up. If he could not have his way, he would have nothing. He would sit in his palace, behind his walls, and let the empire rot. And rot it did. In the northeast, a Jurchen chieftain named Narhasai began uniting the tribes of Manchuria. He created a new script for his people, a new military system based on 8 banners, a new sense of identity. In 1616, he declared himself Khan and founded the later Jin Dynasty, the precursor to the Qing. The Ming generals on the frontier sent urgent warning, desperate pleas for funds and reinforcements. The warnings piled up in the palace unread. The pleas went unanswered. Wanli, in his gilded seclusion, heard nothing, or if he heard, he did not care. In the provinces, the weather turned. The Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling, brought droughts and floods, famines and plagues. The harvests failed. The peasants starved. In Shanxi province, a region already devastated by poverty, desperate men began to organize. They robbed granaries, attacked tax collectors, fled into the mountain. They were called bandits by the authorities, but they were something more. They were the first tremors of an earthquake that would bring down the dynasty. Wanli died in 1620, still on his throne, still in his palace, still refusing to engage with the world he had abandoned. His son, the Taicheng emperor, lasted exactly 1 month before dying under mysterious circumstance, poisoned, some said, by rivals within the palace. And then the throne passed to a boy of 15. His name was Zhu Yaojian. History would remember him as the Chongzhen emperor. He would be the last. The Chongzhen emperor inherited a catastrophe. The treasury was empty. The army was unpaid. The northeast was in open rebellion. The northwest was swarming with bandits. And the climate, indifferent to human suffering, continued its cruel cycle of drought and flood. He was a serious young man, hardworking and sincere, determined to reverse the decay. He rose before dawn, worked late into the night, read every memorial, considered every petition. He dismissed corrupt eunuchs, executed incompetent generals, tried desperately to reform a system that had been crumbling for a century. But it was too late. The machine was broken, and no single man could fix it. The bandits in Shanxi had found a leader. His name was Li Zicheng. He had been a postal worker, a humble courier carrying messages across the province, until the government, in a misguided cost-cutting measure, eliminated his job. He became a soldier, then a deserter, then a rebel. He was tall and strong, with a voice that carried across a battlefield and a charisma that drew men to his banner. He promised his followers land, food, justice. He led them out of the mountains and into the rich valleys of central China. By 1640, he commanded an army of hundreds of thousands. By 1642, he controlled all of Henan and Hubei. By 1643, he declared himself the king of the Shun dynasty, a rival to the Ming. And in the spring of 1644, he marched on Beijing. Inside the Forbidden City, Chongzhen watched the reports arrive with growing despair. The imperial armies, unpaid and unfed, melted away before the rebel advance. The generals who remained loyal sent desperate pleas for money, for troops, for anything that might stop the tide. Chongzhen emptied the palace treasury, donated his personal savings, begged his courtiers to contribute. They gave nothing. They hoarded their gold, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. The emperor, surrounded by parasites, was utterly alone. On the 23rd of April, 1644, the rebel army reached the outskirts of Beijing. They camped outside the walls, hundreds of thousands strong, their campfires lighting the night sky like a second firmament. Inside the city, panic spread. The wealthy hid their treasures. The poor prepared to welcome the new order. The imperial guards, unpaid for months, deserted their posts. The gates, the mighty gates that had held for 2 centuries, stood undefended. Chongzhen called his last court session. The officials who bothered to attend stood in silence, their eyes on the floor. No one spoke. No one offered advice. No one volunteered to lead the defense. The emperor looked at them, these men who owed him everything and gave him nothing, and felt a cold fury that was also a cold despair. He dismissed them. He walked back through the empty halls, past the thrones and the garden, past the quarters where his ancestors had lived and died, past the vermilion walls that had once seemed so powerful and now seemed so fragile. He summoned his children, his 3 sons. He dressed them in commoners' clothes, told them to flee, to hide, to survive. He watched them go, these boys who would never be emperors, who would spend the rest of their lives as fugitives or captive. And then he turned to his wife, the Empress Jo. She looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only sorrow. "For 18 years, my lord," she said, "you have not listened to my advice. Now let me go first." She walked into the inner chamber, closed the door, and hanged herself. Chongzhen did not follow immediately. He had one more task. His daughter, the Princess Changping, was still in the palace. She was 15, beautiful, innocent. He found her in her quarters, trembling, waiting. He looked at her, this child who had done nothing wrong, and he knew what he had to do. The rebels would find her. They would use her, humiliate her, destroy her. He could not allow it. He raised his sword. She looked at him, puzzled, perhaps still hopping for rescue. He swung. The blade caught her arm, severing it, and she fell, screaming. He could not finish. He dropped the sword and ran. The night of April 24th, 1644. The city was silent, holding its breath. The rebel army waited outside the walls, and inside, the dynasty was dying. Chongzhen, the last emperor of the Ming, walked through the empty palace one last time. He passed through the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where his ancestors had received the tribute of the world. He passed through the gate of heavenly purity, into the inner court where his family had lived. He passed the quarters of his concubine, who had already taken their own lives, their bodies lying in silence behind paper screens. At the Meridian Gate, the great southern entrance, he stopped. He could hear in the distance the sounds of the rebel camp, the murmur of voices, the nicker of horses, the occasional shout. He could smell smoke on the wind. He turned and climbed. He climbed to the top of Prospect Hill, the artificial mountain north of the palace, the same hill where Yongle had stood 2 centuries before, looking down on his creation. Now his descendants stood in the same place, looking down on the end of everything. Below him, the Forbidden City lay spread out like a map. The golden roofs gleamed in the moonlight. The courtyard stretched in perfect geometry. The walls that had seemed so mighty, were just lines in the darkness. He could see in the distance the rebel campfire, a ring of fire around his capital. He could see closer the empty streets of Beijing, the houses dark, the people hiding. He could see it all, and he knew that he had failed. He had tried. God knows he had tried. He had risen before dawn, worked late into the night, done everything a man could do. But it was not enough. It had never been enough. The corruption, the decay, the centuries of isolation and paranoia, they had all led to this moment, to this hill, to this man alone with his thoughts. He took off his imperial robe, the yellow dragon robe that marked him as the son of heaven. He hung it on a branch of the scholar tree beside him. He found a beam, a simple wooden beam, and he tied his sash around it. He looked out one last time at the city he had failed to save, at the dynasty he had failed to preserve, at the ancestors who were waiting for him in the shadow world. He thought perhaps of Yongle, the great builder, the bloody usurper, the man whose ambition had created this gilded cage. He thought of Zheng He, sailing the oceans, bringing the world to China's feet. He thought of the scholars and the eunuchs, the concubines and the guards, all the millions of lives that had been lived and lost within these walls. And then he put his head in the noose, and he stepped off the beam. The last emperor of the Ming died alone on a hillside in the dark. His body hung there until morning, when the rebels found it, still wearing its plain blue robe, the dragon robe hanging on a branch nearby. Li Zicheng, the peasant who had become a king, ordered him buried with minimal honors. He was not cruel, this rebel. He was simply practical. The emperor was dead. Long live the new dynasty. But the new dynasty did not last. Li Zicheng's men, drunk on victory, looted the city and alienated the people. The Ming general at the Great Wall, a man named Wu Sangui, was caught between the rebels in Beijing and the Manchus in the northeast. He made a choice, the choice that would echo through history. He opened the gates of the Great Wall and let the Manchus in. They marched on Beijing, defeated Li Zicheng, and declared a new dynasty, the Qing. The Manchus, the barbarians from beyond the wall, became the new masters of the Forbidden City. The Ming Dynasty was over. It had lasted 276 years, from the rise of a peasant orphan to the death of a desperate emperor on a hill. It had built the greatest palace the world had ever seen, launched the largest fleet in history, and created a culture of such refinement and beauty that it still shapes our imagination today. It had also isolated itself, paralyzed itself, and ultimately destroyed itself, a victim of its own perfection. The Forbidden City still stands. You can walk through it today, through the halls where emperors ruled and eunuchs schemed, through the courtyards where concubines whispered and guards patrolled. You can stand in the Hall of Supreme Harmony where the dragon throne still sits, empty, waiting. You can climb Prospect Hill to the spot where the scholar tree once grew, where the last emperor took his life. And if you listen carefully, in the silence between the footsteps of the tourists, you might hear the echo, the groan of 15,000 men pulling a stone across the ice, the snap of silk sails in a tropical wind, the whisper of a eunuch betraying a friend, the last, desperate breath of a man who had inherited a world and lost it. The walls are still vermilion, the roofs are still gold, The city endures, a monument to ambition, to beauty, to power, and to the fragile, fleeting nature of it all. The emperors are gone. The dynasty is dust. But the forbidden city remains, waiting for the next son of heaven who will never come.